The video begins with a deep, immersive cold open, plunging the audience into a world of dim candlelight, heavy wooden doors, and the rhythmic creak of floorboards under the weight of unseen footsteps. The wind howls outside the plantation's main house, rattling the shutters and carrying the faint sound of chains clinking in the distance, like echoes from the earth itself. Thunder rumbles low and slow, vibrating through the walls, echoing the dread that has settled over this place, not just as a momentary disturbance, but as a persistent, living pulse of unease that seems built into the architecture. The camera lingers on a darkened hallway where the shadows of furniture stretch and twist unnaturally, almost as if the very walls are alive, observing every movement, memorizing every breath. A single candle flickers, its flame bending in response to some unseen current, casting a trembling glow over a narrow stairwell that disappears into layers of darkness. The stairwell suggests both confinement and inevitability, like a throat leading downward into some hidden truth. The narrative voice begins quietly, almost conspiratorially, speaking of the day the enslaved woman first arrived at the plantation, a day that seemed ordinary but would mark the beginning of the household's descent into chaos. Her presence is introduced not with fanfare, but with subtle, intimate details, the worn shoes scraping softly against the wooden floor, the quiet, measured steps of someone who knows she must obey yet carries within her a silent defiance. Her breath is slow and quiet, shaped by years of suppression, yet beneath it is a pulse that refuses to bend fully to the will of others. Even her posture conveys a story, a slight hunch of caution paired with a spine that refuses to break. The audience is invited to look closely, to see beyond what the house's residents would have seen. Already the film frames her not as an object but as a force. From the outset, the audience senses that this is a place of oppressive order. The family that owns the plantation is not introduced by name at first, instead, attention is drawn to their rituals, their control, the way they move through rooms with a sense of entitlement that borders on ritualistic. Their authority is portrayed not through dialogue but through gestures, the father's hands clasped behind his back as he inspects rooms, the mother's slow, scrutinizing glances over dinner tables and polished silverware, the eldest son's arrogant, predatory posture, and the daughter's uneasy, almost sickly softness as she mimics the manners expected of her. The enslaved woman's arrival is framed against this backdrop. She is an intrusion, a human presence that unsettles the carefully balanced structure of the household. Every glance she receives, every whispered word carries weight, like the adding of tiny stones to a scale already straining to maintain equilibrium. The camera lingers on small details, a hand tightening around a railing, a servant casting a wary glance toward a shadowed corner, the flicker of candlelight catching on a mirror that seems to reflect not just the room, but some deeper, darker truth, one that the household collectively refuses to acknowledge. The cinematography gives every object a symbolic presence. The carpets seem to suffocate the floorboards beneath them, the tapestries stare down like silent judges, and a grandfather clock looms with its relentless ticking, its chimes not comforting but accusatory, as though counting down towards something catastrophic. Early hints of the household's fragility are embedded in these moments. A door left slightly ajar, despite the family's obsession with order. A drawer that won't close properly, as though something unseen is obstructing it. A window rattling against its frame, not with the wind alone, but with some internal pressure, as if the house itself is straining to hold its secrets. Each small irregularity is presented not as coincidence, but as a symptom of an impending collapse. Even the air in the rooms feels charged, like static before lightning strikes. The enslaved woman's eyes, described with painstaking detail, reflect both fear and cunning, a duality that hints at her complex inner life. They are not simply eyes that have witnessed suffering, they are eyes that have recorded it, archived it, and weaponized it as resolve. The narration emphasizes her silence, her ability to navigate the household with quiet intelligence, and the subtle, almost imperceptible ways she begins to assert her presence. Small acts, a delayed response to an order, a mislaid object, a slight hesitation in a chore, are amplified through cinematic description to suggest that her influence, though not overt, is already unsettling the household's balance. She speaks rarely, but when she does, her words are measured, and the pauses between them feel loaded, like a code, like a warning. Atmosphere dominates this section. The sound design is described in narrative terms: the distant barking of dogs, the rhythmic pounding of rain against the roof, the hollow echo of footsteps in empty hallways. Even the natural world seems complicit in foreshadowing disaster. Branches scratch against windows, a flock of crows circles ominously overhead, and the air itself is thick, almost viscous, carrying the scent of damp earth and burning wood. Each sensory detail reinforces the psychological tension, inviting the audience to feel the claustrophobia and unease that grips everyone in the household. There is a moment when the music fades entirely and the audience is left with nothing but the sounds of breathing, both hers and others, as though the house itself is a living organism inhaling and exhaling around her. The narrative also introduces subtle hints of superstition and rumor. Servants exchange furtive glances, some muttering prayers under their breath. Local townspeople are shown at a distance, described as wary, keeping away from the plantation yet unable to ignore the sense of foreboding that emanates from it like a miasma. A child's toy is found broken in an unusual pattern, as though snapped by intention rather than accident. A candle burns down unnaturally fast, its wax pooling in an odd formation that resembles a distorted face. These small, uncanny incidents are presented as early omens of the larger calamities to come. They are not screamed to the audience, they are whispered, planted like seeds. There is also a sense of generational rot, a spiritual corrosion that has taken root long before the enslaved woman's arrival. It is hinted that the land itself holds a memory of exploitation, that blood and tears have soaked into its soil, that the house stands not on a foundation of wood and stone but on a foundation of suffering. The voices of the past seem to murmur through cracks in the walls, through gaps in the floorboards, through the fireplaces that still hold the blackened smell of old burning. The enslaved woman, though largely silent in these early moments, is already intertwined with the household's fate. Her movements, expressions, and even her absence in certain rooms seem to ripple outward, creating tension and uncertainty. Her presence disrupts routines that had gone unchanged for years. Her very existence becomes a catalyst for the unraveling of illusions the family has relied upon. The section ends by tightening the focus on the duality of fear and fascination. The family views her as property, as a means to an end, but there is an undercurrent of anxiety. They sense, perhaps instinctively, that she is not fully controllable. The plantation's patriarch looks at her with a stern, dismissive certainty, but beneath it is a flicker of apprehension. The matriarch studies her with coldness tinged by something else, something like recognition or resentment or both. The daughter watches her with fascination, curiosity, and something close to empathy. The son watches her with predatory interest, which itself feels like foreshadowed violence. Each perspective reveals a different fear. The camera lingers on a close-up of her eyes reflecting candlelight, suggesting depth, calculation, and hidden emotion. The thunderstorm outside reaches a crescendo, rain lashes against the windows with renewed intensity, and the narrative voice leaves the audience on a knife edge. A sense of impending catastrophe is palpable, yet the exact nature of it remains unknowable. It is as though the night itself is holding its breath. This establishes a slow-burning tension that will carry through the rest of the story, anchoring the audience in both the historical reality of the plantation and the psychological horror of a household teetering on the brink of ruin. The cold open concludes by drawing together environment, character, and foreshadowing, the enslaved woman's quiet intelligence, the household's brittle order, the storm-laden night, the murmurs of rumor and superstition, and the subtle, unsettling events that mark her arrival. Each element combines to immerse the audience fully in a world of fear, anticipation, and moral complexity. By the end of the section, viewers are left with a lingering sense of dread, the weight of historical cruelty, and the expectation that the household's fragile stability will soon be shattered in ways both tangible and psychological, through forces human and perhaps more than human, leaving behind consequences that will echo long beyond the storm and far beyond the confines of the plantation walls. The story deepens as the audience is transported into the heart of the plantation itself, a sprawling complex of fields, quarters, and hidden corners where the rhythm of life is dictated by labor, hierarchy, and fear. The narrative begins by painting a vivid picture of the estate from a distance, the main house, with its whitewashed walls and shuttered windows, stands atop a slight rise, dominating the surrounding fields. Cotton and tobacco stretch out in neat, disciplined rows under the relentless southern sun. Yet beneath this apparent order lies a different reality, a world of invisible boundaries, whispered rules, and ever-present surveillance. The camera lingers on the boundary lines where the fields meet the forest, noting the contrast between cultivated land and untamed wilderness, symbolizing the tension between control and chaos that will ripple through the household. Inside the main house, details abound, polished wooden floors that gleam in the morning light, chandeliers that sway slightly with the draft of open windows, and ornate furniture that serves as both decoration and assertion of power. The family's influence is felt in every corner, from the way the silverware is arranged on the dining table to the strict schedule imposed on every worker. Yet this meticulousness is a thin veneer. The narrative emphasizes the stark difference between appearance and reality, showing how fear, oppression, and secrets shape the lives of everyone under the plantation's roof. The enslaved woman, recently introduced, is now a silent observer of these dynamics, moving through rooms with caution, noting each glance, each subtle gesture, and each unspoken tension that permeates the household. The quarters of the enslaved workers are described in intimate, sensory detail: narrow rooms, low ceilings, and dirt floors, the scent of smoke, sweat, and damp earth, and the faint rustle of animals nesting nearby. These spaces are both refuge and prison, representing the constant struggle to preserve identity, dignity, and survival under conditions designed to strip humanity. Conversations among the workers are fragmented, whispered in corners to avoid detection, carrying rumors of misfortune, whispered warnings, and faint traces of superstition. The narrative emphasizes the quiet resilience of the enslaved, their subtle acts of defiance, misplaced tools, small delays in work, covertly shared food or messages, and how these small gestures ripple through the larger household, sowing tension, unease, and occasionally admiration or fear among the overseers. Attention turns to the family hierarchy and interpersonal dynamics within the plantation. Masters and mistresses are described not only through their wealth and outward authority but also through their psychological patterns, the obsessive control they exert over routines, their disregard for human suffering, and the brittle egos that leave them vulnerable to fear and rumor. Servants navigate this hierarchy with a mixture of obedience and cautious manipulation, aware that even minor missteps can result in punishment. The enslaved woman's place within this system is carefully explored. Her status is neither entirely marginal nor fully defined, allowing her movements, decisions, and even small acts of subversion to have disproportionate impact. This subtle positioning sets the stage for her eventual influence over the household's unraveling, though at this point it is barely perceptible, hinted at through the reactions of those around her. The natural world is woven into the narrative, adding layers of tension and symbolism. The oppressive heat of the summer sun presses down on both fields and household, making every task more grueling and amplifying tempers. Birds circle in the sky, their cries echoing across the open fields, while insects hum incessantly, marking the passage of time and the relentlessness of labor. Storm clouds gather on the horizon, a recurring motif that mirrors the undercurrents of fear and the inevitability of conflict. Even the wind seems to carry whispers of unrest, rustling through the trees, catching on the edges of shutters, and slipping into open doorways. These environmental cues reinforce the emotional landscape, blending the psychological tension of the humans with the natural pressures of the setting. Superstitions and secrets are layered throughout this section. Rumors among the enslaved speak of spirits, curses, and ancestral protection, while the family dismisses or ignores these beliefs, seeing them as quaint or irrelevant. Yet small, unexplained incidents begin to occur: a tool mysteriously misplaced, a child's toy found broken, livestock behaving oddly. These incidents, seemingly minor, are narrated with careful attention to sensory and emotional detail, emphasizing how even trivial events can erode trust, sow suspicion, and destabilize carefully maintained hierarchies. The enslaved woman's awareness of these undercurrents is highlighted. Her silence and observation mark her as an agent who perceives and absorbs tension in ways others cannot. The section also explores the internal lives of those bound to labor. Workers dream, hope, and grieve, yet their movements are constrained by the watchful eyes of overseers and the invisible weight of fear. The enslaved woman's thoughts are rendered in detail, the tension between obedience and survival, the subtle ways she measures the moods of those around her, and the careful strategies she employs to maintain her safety while quietly asserting presence. Her perspective offers a window into the emotional undercurrents of the plantation, contrasting the rigid external order with the rich, complex internal worlds of the enslaved. As the narrative progresses, the audience is shown how these undercurrents begin to ripple outward. Minor disputes between workers escalate into subtle confrontations, the master's impatience and paranoia grow, and the enslaved woman, though still outwardly compliant, begins to be recognized as a presence that cannot be fully controlled. Foreshadowing of household collapse is interwoven with everyday events, showing how fear, secrecy, and human emotion combine to create a fragile ecosystem easily disrupted. Each scene builds atmosphere, blending historical realism with psychological insight, ensuring the audience feels both the weight of the setting and the tension simmering beneath the surface. By the end of the section, viewers understand that the plantation is not merely a physical space but a complex web of power, fear, and secrecy. The enslaved woman, though introduced earlier, is now established as a central figure whose awareness, intelligence, and subtle defiance begin to unsettle the fragile balance of the household. Environmental pressures, social hierarchies, and human emotions all converge to create a palpable tension, foreshadowing the unraveling to come. The plantation itself becomes a character, oppressive, watchful, and ready to bear witness to the tragedies and moral complexities about to unfold. This section closes with a focus on the duality of life on the plantation, outwardly orderly, yet internally fractious, productive, yet morally corrupt, structured, yet susceptible to collapse. Through sensory immersion, character insight, and detailed historical context, the audience is drawn fully into the world of the enslaved woman, the family, and the fragile ecosystem they inhabit. The stage is set for the next chapter of the story, where the arrival of the forced union will begin to tip the household further toward chaos, tension, and inevitable ruin. The narrative shifts to a moment of personal tragedy intertwined with societal cruelty, the forced union that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of the household. The scene opens with the woman's introduction to the master's family, framed not as a ceremonial or celebratory event but as a quiet imposition, heavy with power, expectation, and the absence of consent. The narrative describes her arrival in meticulous detail, the sound of her footsteps against the polished floor, the slight tremor in her hands, and the careful way she avoids looking directly at the eyes of those who would now claim authority over her. The household watches her closely, the men with a predatory calculation, the women with either curiosity or cold appraisal, all weighing her presence against their own rigid hierarchies. The camera lingers on her face, capturing fleeting expressions of fear, resolve, and quiet determination, suggesting that even in submission, her mind remains alert, calculating, and aware of her precarious position. The dynamics of power within the marriage are immediately established. The master's son, young but brimming with entitlement, regards her as both property and trophy, a tool to reinforce his family's social status. The narrative details his gestures, the subtle ways he asserts dominance, his gaze, his touch, his carefully chosen words, and contrasts them with the woman's careful, measured reactions. She is outwardly compliant, performing the role expected of her, yet small acts, a hesitation, a glance, a whispered mutter, signal her unwillingness to surrender entirely. These small moments are amplified through cinematic description, emphasizing how power and resistance coexist in the same space, creating tension that will ripple outward through the household. The household itself is depicted as a stage for this forced union. Servants move silently, adjusting linens, serving refreshments, and observing interactions with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Each participant in the event contributes to a silent chorus of expectation, judgment, and unease. The narrative highlights the way gossip begins even in these early moments, a servant's whispered speculation about the woman's past, a subtle exchange of glances between relatives, and a quiet measurement of her worth not by character or intellect, but by compliance and the projected utility to the family. This social calculus, embedded within the household, foreshadows the slow psychological erosion that will unfold, showing how the weight of human cruelty and expectation can shape, and distort, the lives of those trapped within it. Attention is given to the internal state of the enslaved woman, whose perspective becomes central to understanding the emotional tension of the household. She experiences a mixture of fear, calculation, and grief, compounded by the knowledge that any misstep could have severe consequences. Her internal dialogue, though not expressed aloud, reveals both resilience and subtle strategies for survival. The narrative emphasizes her ability to navigate the household's hierarchy with careful observation, interpreting gestures, expressions, and the unspoken rules that govern behavior. Even as she moves through the ceremony of marriage, the reader senses her awareness of how small choices, subtle acts of defiance, or strategic silence might protect her, even as the formal power of the household seeks to crush her autonomy. The atmosphere is laden with foreboding. Candles flicker in tall sconces, casting long shadows across the walls, while the wind rattles shutters and the distant sound of the forest seems to echo unease. The narrative emphasizes the contrast between the outwardly polished surfaces of wealth, the chandeliers, the silver, the fine fabrics, and the darkness that pervades the household, a darkness of fear, resentment, and moral decay. Every detail of the setting reflects the tension between control and chaos, safety and vulnerability, power and resistance. Even the natural world seems to respond to the arrival of the woman. Birds scatter from trees, the wind carries ominous murmurs through the halls, and the atmosphere itself appears to press down on all who inhabit it. The section also explores the reactions of others within the household. Family members vary in their approach, some are indifferent, treating her presence as an inconvenience, others are hostile, seeing her as a threat or as competition, and a few are quietly intrigued, sensing the complexity of her mind and the subtle power she carries. Servants and laborers watch closely, interpreting every gesture and word, aware that the household's fragile equilibrium may shift with even minor disruptions. These interactions, rendered with detailed description and attention to psychological nuance, establish early patterns of tension, resentment, and fear, while hinting at the influence the woman will quietly exert over the household in the months and years to come. A sense of inevitability pervades the narrative. Though the union is forced and the woman outwardly compliant, the tension between submission and autonomy, oppression and agency, is palpable. The narrative dwells on small but significant incidents, a mislaid object, a delayed response, a glance that lingers too long, all subtle signals of her presence and influence. These details, though minor on the surface, are laden with narrative weight, foreshadowing the psychological and social disruptions she will catalyze within the household. The contrast between the household's outward order and the inner tension generated by her presence is emphasized, creating suspense that builds toward the eventual unraveling of the family's fragile stability. By the end of the section, the audience is acutely aware of the stakes. The enslaved woman's forced marriage is not simply a personal tragedy but the spark that will ignite the household's slow descent into ruin. Her combination of compliance and subtle resistance, the oppressive environment of the plantation, and the simmering tensions among family and servants create a charged atmosphere. The narrative leaves viewers with a lingering sense of unease, the recognition that while the union is formalized in appearance, the balance of power is already shifting in imperceptible, dangerous ways. The stage is now fully set for the escalating whispers, omens, and fractures that will soon grip the plantation, as the household begins its slow, inevitable collapse under the weight of fear, superstition, and human cruelty. With the forced union established, the narrative shifts to the subtle yet insidious beginnings of unrest within the household. The early signs are small, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, yet to those who live under the plantation's rigid hierarchy, they are enough to provoke unease. The section opens with descriptions of minor disruptions, a chair overturned in an empty room, a tray of silverware slightly misplaced, livestock refusing to follow usual patterns, and servants reporting strange noises in the dead of night. These seemingly trivial incidents are amplified through cinematic detail, each described with a tension-laden, sensory-rich perspective, emphasizing how even small anomalies can ripple through a tightly controlled environment. The narrative stresses that these disturbances are not yet catastrophic, but they are significant, the household's fragile equilibrium is beginning to shift, and the enslaved woman's presence is increasingly felt as both a symbol and a catalyst of this subtle chaos. The story introduces the whispers that begin circulating among the household staff. Servants exchange furtive glances, speak in hushed tones, and interpret coincidences as omens. The narrative emphasizes the psychological weight of rumor, exploring how fear can amplify even the smallest irregularity. Some claim they have seen shadows move without explanation, others insist that they hear low, mournful cries echoing through empty corridors. Each whispered story, no matter how trivial, is treated with cinematic importance, heightening the audience's sense of suspense. The enslaved woman is both subject and observer in this world of rumor. Her silence becomes a canvas upon which others project their anxieties, superstitions, and fears. Her measured expressions, quiet gestures, and unobtrusive movements are scrutinized, interpreted, and sometimes misread, adding layers of tension to the narrative. Environmental details reinforce the sense of unease. Storm clouds gather on the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields. The wind carries eerie sounds through open windows, rustling trees in ways that suggest whispering voices. Animals behave oddly, chickens scatter suddenly, dogs growl at empty spaces, and horses refuse to enter stables without hesitation. These elements of nature, described in rich, sensory detail, serve as both foreshadowing and metaphor, reflecting the inner turmoil of the household and the subtle influence of the woman's presence. The narrative emphasizes that the plantation itself seems alive, attuned to tension and capable of amplifying human fear, creating a cinematic landscape in which even ordinary events are charged with meaning. The section also explores the reactions of the family members to these early signs. Some dismiss them outright, attributing unusual occurrences to coincidence, fatigue, or poor memory. Others grow increasingly anxious, sensing that something beyond reason is affecting their lives. The narrative delves into their psychological states, revealing cracks in authority and confidence. The master's son, newly wed to the enslaved woman, experiences moments of irritation, fear, and confusion, while the matriarch exhibits a brittle kind of vigilance, monitoring servants, objects, and spaces for evidence of disruption. These reactions create tension between rationality and superstition, reason and fear, reflecting the slow erosion of control that will accelerate in later sections. Foreshadowing of larger, more dramatic events begins here. The narrative introduces small but significant patterns. A servant falls mysteriously ill after a minor accident, a room is found in disarray with no one able to explain it, or a child experiences nightmares of shadowy figures. Each incident is described with heightened emotional and sensory detail, emphasizing psychological impact rather than physical horror. The enslaved woman's role in these events is deliberately ambiguous, whether she is actively influencing them, a silent observer, or merely perceived as responsible remains unclear. This ambiguity is central to the storytelling, reinforcing tension and leaving the audience questioning motive, causality, and morality. The section also explores the social dynamics of fear. Gossip spreads quickly among both enslaved workers and family members, blending fact with exaggeration. Servants speculate about curses, bad luck, or divine punishment, while family members struggle to reconcile rational explanations with their growing anxiety. The narrative emphasizes the interplay between power, suspicion, and psychological stress, showing how fear can be weaponized, misinterpreted, and magnified. The enslaved woman, though outwardly silent and compliant, becomes the focal point of these swirling rumors, her presence intensifying pre-existing tensions and heightening the household's vulnerability to psychological collapse. Supernatural undertones are introduced subtly, not as overt horror but as atmospheric suggestion. Shadows lengthen unnaturally in candlelight, footsteps echo in empty hallways, and the wind carries whispers indistinguishable from human voices. These moments are presented with careful attention to sensory detail, scent, temperature, sound, and movement, all contributing to an oppressive, uneasy mood. The audience is made to feel the ambiguity between natural occurrences and the possibility of the uncanny. This ambiguity reinforces the theme of uncertainty, highlighting how fear and superstition can magnify ordinary events into moments of crisis. By the end of the section, the early anomalies and whispers have begun to weave a dense web of tension throughout the household. The audience understands that what seems like minor disruption is the prelude to larger, more dramatic consequences. The enslaved woman's presence is now inseparable from the household's psychological atmosphere, her silent influence casting long shadows over every interaction, rumor, and unexplained event. The plantation, once merely a physical space, has become a theater of tension, suspicion, and unease, where every shadow, sound, and gesture carries potential significance. The section closes on a note of quiet dread, emphasizing the slow, insidious buildup of fear and superstition. The camera lingers on empty hallways, flickering candlelight, and distant thunder, creating a sense of anticipation for the chaos to come. The audience is left with a lingering sense that the household's fragile order is already compromised, that the whispers and omens are harbingers of deeper collapse, and that the enslaved woman, though seemingly powerless, has become central to the unfolding mystery. The stage is set for the next chapter, where the fractures within the household will deepen, and the tension between innocence, authority, and silent resistance will escalate toward inevitable confrontation. As the initial whispers and subtle omens ripple through the plantation, the narrative shifts to the slow, almost imperceptible fracturing of the household. This section begins with the depiction of daily life unraveling, showing how minor disturbances escalate into psychological, social, and emotional breakdowns. Servants move through the halls with growing hesitation, carefully avoiding rooms where accidents or unexplained phenomena have occurred. Every misstep, misplacement, or small failure is magnified under the oppressive scrutiny of the masters and mistresses, and the enslaved woman, still outwardly compliant, is increasingly perceived as the epicenter of these disturbances. Cinematic attention is given to the physical spaces, doors left ajar, the creaking of floorboards in empty corridors, and shadows that seem to stretch unnaturally, emphasizing the fragility and instability of the household's environment. The narrative explores the psychological tensions within the family itself. The master's son, initially confident in his authority, begins to show cracks of paranoia. Small disruptions, an overturned chair, a broken dish, a servant's hushed warning, take on disproportionate significance, and his responses oscillate between anger, denial, and fear. The matriarch's vigilance becomes increasingly obsessive, as she monitors servants, inspects rooms repeatedly, and interprets every minor irregularity as a potential threat to the household's reputation and order. Family members begin to argue over trivial matters, their interactions increasingly strained, brittle, and charged with suspicion. The enslaved woman's presence, silent, observant, and enigmatic, magnifies this tension, though her intentions remain ambiguous, leaving both the household and the audience uncertain of her role in the growing disorder. Attention is given to the slave's perspective, highlighting how fear, superstition, and observation intertwine. Workers whisper in corners, exchanging stories of shadows, inexplicable noises, and unexplainable accidents. Some act with deliberate caution, avoiding certain rooms or tasks, while others spread rumors to protect themselves or assert influence. The enslaved woman, navigating this web of fear and superstition, begins to exert subtle influence, a withheld piece of information, a carefully timed gesture, or an expression interpreted as warning or judgment. These small acts, seemingly innocuous, begin to ripple outward, disrupting social cohesion and intensifying suspicion among both the family and the household staff. The narrative emphasizes the contrast between outward appearances and internal turmoil. On the surface, the plantation continues its routines, fields are tended, meals are prepared, and chores are performed with apparent diligence. Yet beneath this facade, the household is unraveling. Tensions between family members and servants become increasingly visible, minor disputes escalate into verbal confrontations, and underlying resentment surface. The enslaved woman's quiet observation allows her to exploit these fissures subtly, whether intentionally or not, making her presence a persistent source of psychological pressure. Cinematic focus is placed on small, symbolic details, a spilled cup of tea, a scratched table, a door swinging open in the wind, each reinforcing the sense that order is tenuous, easily disrupted, and on the verge of collapse. Superstitions and fear continue to gain traction in this section. Reports of omens, curses, and ghostly phenomena intensify, blending with the family's growing paranoia. A servant may describe seeing figures in candlelight where none exist, or livestock might refuse to enter certain spaces for no apparent reason. The masters and mistresses wrestle with disbelief and dread, attempting to rationalize events while their anxiety mounts. The narrative presents these occurrences with careful attention to sensory detail, the rustle of fabric, the clatter of objects, the flicker of shadows, creating a palpable atmosphere of tension and uncertainty. The enslaved woman's silent presence amplifies this unease, her quiet intelligence and composed demeanor interpreted as both threat and mystery. Social dynamics within the household begin to fracture in distinct ways. Alliances form and dissolve rapidly among servants, some seeking to align with perceived authority, others attempting to shield themselves from blame. Rumors about the woman's intentions or supernatural influence circulate, further dividing the staff. Among the family, trust erodes quickly, siblings argue over management decisions, spouses clash over interpretations of events, and minor disagreements become evidence of moral or psychological failing. This deterioration is described in detail, with each conflict framed to show its emotional and psychological weight, heightening the sense that the household is careening toward an inevitable breaking point. The narrative also explores the enslaved woman's emerging role as a focal point of both fascination and fear. Her intelligence, adaptability, and subtle manipulation of household dynamics make her presence increasingly central. Family members and servants alike attempt to interpret her motives, though they are never certain of her intentions. This ambiguity is critical. It allows the narrative to maintain tension, leaving the audience questioning whether she is orchestrating the household's decline, responding to external pressures, or simply surviving within an oppressive system. Her silence, watchful gaze, and measured responses are described with cinematic precision, emphasizing the psychological power she wields despite her formal lack of authority. Environmental and atmospheric elements continue to reflect the household's fracturing. Storm clouds gather on the horizon, shadows lengthen unnaturally in candlelight, and the wind carries sounds that suggest movement where there is none. The plantation, once a symbol of stability and control, becomes a character in its own right, a silent witness to human cruelty, fear, and the gradual erosion of order. Every creak, rustle, and flicker of light is imbued with narrative weight, reinforcing the slow, inevitable deterioration of both physical and social structures within the household. By the end of the section, the audience is fully aware that the household is no longer stable. Psychological tension, social fragmentation, and environmental cues combine to create a world on the brink of collapse. The enslaved woman, though outwardly compliant, has become a central agent in this unraveling, whether by design, survival instinct, or the perception of others. Minor incidents have compounded into patterns of fear and mistrust, foreshadowing the more dramatic escalations to come. The section closes on a note of pervasive unease. Family members are exhausted by the constant tension, servants are increasingly wary, and the plantation itself seems to exhale an oppressive weight. Shadows stretch across hallways, rain begins to patter against windows, and the distant rumble of thunder underscores the sense that a larger catastrophe is imminent. The audience is left with a lingering sense that the cracks in the household structure are widening, that human cruelty and superstition are intertwining with psychological fragility, and that the enslaved woman, at the center of this web, holds both mystery and power within her silent presence. The stage is set for escalating chaos, as whispers and fears transition into overt confrontations and the slow collapse of the household's fragile equilibrium. As the household fractures and tension reaches a palpable peak, the narrative shifts to the various attempts by family members, neighbors, and local authorities to make sense of the chaos. Minor disturbances and inexplicable incidents, which had previously been dismissed or whispered about in corners, now demand attention. The master and matriarch call upon outsiders, doctors, clergy, and local figures of authority, each bringing their own lens of interpretation to the unraveling household. The section opens with a cinematic depiction of these arrivals, a carriage rumbling up the dusty plantation road, the distant bark of dogs warning of visitors, and the subtle anticipation of those who live within the estate. The atmosphere is tense, electric with the sense that explanations, whether rational or superstitious, may provide relief, or exacerbate the unease. The narrative details the first outsider's impressions. A local physician, skeptical of superstition but aware of social expectations, examines minor injuries, unexplained illnesses, and the psychological state of the family members and servants. His observations are precise yet limited. He notes signs of fatigue, stress, and tension, attributing incidents to nervousness, overwork, or environmental conditions. Despite his empirical approach, he cannot account for the strange occurrences, objects displaced without explanation, livestock behaving erratically, and the pervasive sense of dread that seems to permeate the walls of the household. The narrative emphasizes the tension between reason and the unknown, highlighting how even rational inquiry struggles to provide certainty in a household governed by fear, superstition, and social hierarchy. Clergy arrive with a different perspective. They bring ritual, prayer, and moral interpretation, viewing the household's disturbances through the lens of divine will or spiritual imbalance. The narrative describes their ministrations, candles flickering in drafty hallways, solemn chants echoing across empty rooms, and careful examination of the household's moral and spiritual conduct. Their presence underscores the household's moral fragility, as they interpret accidents, omens, and misfortune as signs of divine displeasure. The enslaved woman is a central figure in their assessment, often regarded with suspicion or as an instrument of misfortune, despite the absence of any overt action on her part. This tension between spiritual interpretation and rational analysis deepens the narrative suspense, highlighting the impossibility of achieving certainty in the midst of fear and chaos. The narrative also explores the family's own attempts to rationalize events. Meetings are held in dimly lit parlors, where the patriarch insists that order must be restored, while the matriarch debates whether discipline, prayer, or exile may be the solution. Servants are questioned, tasks scrutinized, and the smallest deviations from routine are dissected for meaning. These interactions reveal the household's growing obsession with control, and the narrative focuses on the psychological toll this obsession takes on both family and staff. Each scene is rendered with cinematic attention to sensory detail, the shuffle of papers, the tension in clenched fists, the flicker of candlelight across anxious faces, all contributing to a sense of mounting dread and frustration. Local townspeople and neighbors contribute additional layers of interpretation. They whisper of curses, hidden resentments, and vengeful spirits, blending observation with legend. The narrative describes their interactions with the household, furtive glances from the road, subtle warnings, and suggestions of spiritual or supernatural intervention. Each outsider contributes to the layering of doubt, fear, and interpretation, creating a dense web of competing theories and unresolved questions. The enslaved woman, ever observant, navigates these narratives carefully, her silence and presence amplifying their uncertainty. The audience is left to consider whether she is truly involved, an innocent observer, or merely a convenient focal point for collective anxiety. Attempts at explanation also include primitive scientific theories and folk remedies. Local herbalists, self-proclaimed physicians, and wandering cures are brought in, offering treatments for illness, sleep disturbances, or behavioral anomalies. These efforts, though well-intentioned, frequently fail or even exacerbate tension, further eroding the household's sense of stability. The narrative emphasizes the clash between empirical knowledge, superstition, and social expectation, highlighting how human attempts to impose order on chaos often reveal their own limitations. The cinematic description of these attempts, pots of steaming herbs, ritual gestures, and anxious faces, enhances the eerie, slow-burning tension, illustrating the futility of human control in a household already teetering on the brink. The psychological toll of these attempts at explanation is explored in detail. Family members oscillate between hope, fear, frustration, and despair, while servants internalize both fear and suspicion. The enslaved woman remains central to these dynamics, her quiet intelligence and subtle acts, observed, misunderstood, or imagined, affecting the perceptions of everyone around her. The narrative emphasizes how perception and interpretation, more than objective reality, begin to drive behavior, decisions, and conflicts. The household becomes a theater of observation, accusation, and second-guessing, where certainty is impossible and tension is omnipresent. This section underscores the growing sense of helplessness. Each attempt to explain or control the situation fails, creating a feedback loop of fear, superstition, and psychological strain. The audience sees the limitations of reason and authority in a household governed by human fragility, moral corruption, and unspoken tension. Objects continue to shift inexplicably, animals continue to behave strangely, and the enslaved woman's presence looms as a silent, ambiguous force, suggesting influence without overt action. The narrative uses cinematic pacing and atmospheric description to convey the slow, inexorable buildup of dread, leaving viewers with a heightened sense of anticipation for the events that will escalate into full-scale chaos. By the end of this section, the audience understands that explanations, rational, spiritual, or folk, cannot contain the unfolding tension. The household is caught between fear and reason, observation and imagination, authority and vulnerability. The enslaved woman, though outwardly passive, remains central to this psychological dynamic, her silence and subtle presence shaping perceptions, fears, and interactions. The stage is set for the next chapter, where isolation, psychological torment, and the intensifying collapse of both social and moral order will propel the household further into ruin. This section delves deeply into the household's desperate search for explanation as events spiral beyond comprehension. The narrative opens with the arrival of a local physician, a man trained in early medical science, who is called to the estate under the pretense of diagnosing physical ailments, though his suspicions extend to the family's collective mental state. He observes subtle symptoms, the master's jittery hands, sleepless nights, and erratic decision-making, alongside the inexplicable illnesses that afflict servants and family members alike. The physician meticulously documents his findings, attributing the disturbances to mold, contaminated water, and what he terms hysteria of the upper classes, reflecting the limited scientific understanding of mental health during the period. In stark contrast, a traveling folklorist arrives on the estate, ostensibly for academic curiosity but driven by personal fascination with tales of ancestral spirits and curses that persist in enslaved communities. He quietly interviews those living in the quarters, recording stories of unexplained whispers, objects moving without cause, and shadows that seem to watch the household. The folklorist identifies patterns that he recognizes from other regions, an oppressed individual's presence often leaving a lingering mark on both physical space and communal psyche. These interpretations are dismissed by the family, yet they begin to gnaw subtly at their sense of reality. The narrative emphasizes the tension between reason and belief, science and superstition, showing how neither framework fully reconciles the ongoing strangeness. While the physician attempts to calm the family through rational explanations, he becomes increasingly unsettled by what he cannot measure, fleeting glimpses of movement at the edges of vision, doors that creak open without wind, and the almost imperceptible sense of being observed. These experiences erode his professional detachment, highlighting the story's psychological core, that fear and guilt can warp perception as profoundly as any external force. The enslaved woman herself remains mostly silent throughout these investigations, yet her presence is palpable. Every rational explanation is undermined by subtle signs she leaves behind, small acts of defiance, a lingering gaze, or objects placed deliberately out of alignment. The section explores how the household interprets these cues differently. The master sees malice, the wife perceives moral corruption, and the folklorist detects a pattern that blends tradition, resistance, and unseen agency. As the household's mental stability declines, minor accidents and illnesses intensify, creating a feedback loop where stress amplifies misfortune, which in turn heightens suspicion and fear. The physician notes elevated tension, hallucinations, and psychosomatic symptoms in almost every resident, suggesting that the house itself has become a crucible for collective anxiety. The folklorist quietly theorizes that the enslaved woman's endurance and silent agency may act as a form of psychic resistance, a force that bends but does not break, leaving an imprint that no amount of rational explanation can erase. This section also examines the broader societal context, showing how scientific thought and superstition coexist uneasily in the South during this era. The physician represents an emergent rationalist worldview struggling to reconcile empirical observation with the realities of oppression, while the folklorist embodies the weight of cultural memory and communal knowledge that refuses to be silenced. Their dual perspectives allow the audience to experience the story from contrasting angles, deepening the sense of mystery and suspense. The climax of this section occurs as both men witness an event that defies explanation. A family member, convinced the house is haunted by the enslaved woman's malice, collapses in terror during dinner, spilling wine and breaking a cherished heirloom, triggering panic among the remaining household staff. The physician is forced to acknowledge that logic cannot contain the unfolding chaos, while the folklorist quietly records the incident, understanding that stories like this often mark the turning point where human endurance collides with oppression and superstition. By the end of this expanded section, the household teeters on the brink of psychological collapse. Every attempt to rationalize or suppress the disturbances fails, and the tension between science and superstition heightens the eerie atmosphere. The section sets the stage for the next phase of the story, where the consequences of unresolved fear, guilt, and coercion begin to manifest in devastating ways, making it clear that the estate's unraveling is now inevitable. This section chronicles the rapid and unavoidable collapse of the estate, portraying the household's disintegration with a cinematic focus on psychological, social, and material decay. The narrative opens with the first tangible signs of ruin: crops failing inexplicably despite careful cultivation, livestock dying or wandering off, and once dependable servants falling ill or abandoning their posts. These events create a mounting sense of dread, as the family interprets each misfortune as evidence of a personal curse rather than natural circumstance. The enslaved woman, though largely silent, becomes a spectral pivot in the household's growing paranoia, her mere presence charged with an ineffable power that amplifies the unfolding chaos. The master, once confident and commanding, begins exhibiting erratic behavior that underscores his moral and psychological decline. Scenes depict him obsessively inspecting the grounds, barking orders that go unheeded, and punishing minor mistakes with disproportionate severity. His obsession with controlling every aspect of the estate mirrors his desperate attempt to suppress both fear and guilt, yet each action only accelerates the collapse. He increasingly isolates himself in his study, poring over ledgers and diaries in a futile search for rational explanations, while his health deteriorates under the weight of stress and insomnia. Meanwhile, the forced husband of the enslaved woman undergoes a harrowing transformation. Initially compliant, he grows increasingly unstable, torn between societal expectation, loyalty to the household, and a hidden empathy for his wife's suffering. Scenes depict him pacing at night, muttering to himself, and confronting his own complicity in a system that has corrupted his moral compass. His internal conflict mirrors the broader theme of the section, that enforced unions and the subjugation of one human being can fracture not only the victim but all those implicated in maintaining the structure of oppression. The household's matriarch, once the symbol of propriety and religious authority, experiences her own psychological unraveling. Her prayers, once fervent and consoling, devolve into obsessive chants and frantic supplications, often directed at the enslaved woman herself. She becomes convinced that her household is under siege by a malevolent force, interpreting every misfortune, whether minor illness, broken object, or sudden cold snap, as evidence of divine or supernatural punishment. Her descent into hysteria amplifies the fear that grips the estate, creating a feedback loop of suspicion, blame, and escalating cruelty. As the estate's collapse continues, the physical environment reflects the moral decay within. Furniture deteriorates, rooms fall into disrepair, and the once pristine gardens grow wild and unkempt. The narrative emphasizes a symbolic connection between the household's internal turmoil and the degradation of the land itself. The enslaved woman's quiet endurance contrasts with the family's frantic attempts at control, reinforcing her role as an agent of change through inaction rather than direct confrontation. The turning point in this section occurs with a series of catastrophes that leave the master's line teetering on the brink of extinction. Fires break out in the outbuildings, animals are lost or slaughtered, and debts accumulate as the estate's management collapses. Neighbors whisper about the family's decline, while local officials avoid involvement, citing poor fortune or mismanagement. Each event compounds the sense of inevitability, demonstrating how systemic cruelty and unresolved tension can catalyze disaster that appears both natural and sinister. The section also explores the community's perception of the estate's ruin. Friends and acquaintances who once admired the family begin to distance themselves, unsure whether to offer help or avoid contagion of the household's perceived misfortune. The narrative captures the creeping isolation experienced by the family, portraying their social detachment as both a cause and effect of their psychological deterioration. Meanwhile, the enslaved woman's reputation among the surrounding community grows in complexity. She is simultaneously feared, respected, and mythologized as the silent force at the heart of the estate's unraveling. By the end of this section, the master's line is effectively broken. The family's authority is undermined, their finances depleted, and their internal relationships fractured beyond repair. The enslaved woman remains physically present but psychologically distant, her quiet endurance casting a shadow over the household's complete moral and structural collapse. This expanded section underscores the inevitability of ruin when oppression, coercion, and human fragility converge, setting the stage for the subsequent isolation and disappearance of key figures in the narrative, and intensifying the eerie, tragic tone that will carry the story toward its haunting resolution. This section captures the estate in its final stages of disintegration, focusing on the isolation and marginalization of the enslaved woman as the household attempts desperately, and futilely, to reclaim order. The narrative opens with the woman increasingly confined to the outskirts of the property, whether physically restricted to the smokehouse and servant quarters or socially shunned by a family that blames her for their unraveling. The atmosphere is heavy and claustrophobic. The air carries the acrid scent of burning wood from failed attempts to clear diseased crops, and shadows stretch unnaturally across walls as the sun dips behind overgrown gardens. The household's attempts at control only reinforce the sense that the estate is unmoored, and that no amount of coercion or punishment can restore stability. The enslaved woman's enforced isolation is both literal and symbolic. Scenes describe her silent observations of the household's collapse, the master wandering aimlessly through decaying halls, muttering incoherently, the matriarch pacing, frantically crossing herself while whispering prayers of accusation, and the forced husband, a broken figure of guilt and indecision, slowly succumbing to despair. Though isolated, she remains an omnipresent force, her endurance and composure contrasting sharply with the family's unraveling, creating a sense of quiet but undeniable power. Her presence becomes a mirror reflecting the household's moral and psychological corruption. In the fading twilight hours, she watches from the shadow behind the smokehouse door as the family takes their supper in near silence. Gone are the nights of boisterous conversation and confident commands. In their place are hushed exchanges, darting glances, and awkward silences punctuated by the sound of utensils scraping ceramic. The family members eat quickly, nervously, as though every clink of glass or shifting chair might provoke something unseen. Sometimes, the enslaved woman catches the master staring out the darkened window, searching for her silhouette in the yard, convinced she lurks there with intention. Other nights, the matriarch insists the servants light every candle in every room, filling the house with uneven, quivering halos of flame that illuminate not comfort or clarity, but the trembling anxiety of fragile minds. The narrative explores the subtle ways in which she exerts influence without action. Small but deliberate acts, moving objects slightly out of place, leaving traces of herself in rooms she is no longer permitted to enter, heighten tension and frustration. A locked drawer appears ever so slightly ajar. A chair slightly shifts from its usual place. A window latch is found open though the glass is firmly shut. The master interprets these as acts of malevolence, the matriarch sees them as spiritual punishment, and the husband is torn between fear, guilt, and protective instinct. These moments are described in rich detail, emphasizing how the unseen and the understated can exert a psychological weight greater than overt confrontation. At times, it becomes unclear whether these disruptions are truly the work of the woman or the manifestation of the household's own paranoia. A glass shatters in an empty room, a door swings open with no wind, footsteps echo in the corridor long after the servants have gone to bed. The husband hears soft, irregular tapping on the floorboards at night and convinces himself it is the woman's doing, yet he cannot explain why the sound seems to come from the walls themselves, or why the patterns resemble more something like coded rhythm than random noise. The matriarch awakens on 3 separate nights to find her rosary tangled and knotted around the bedpost, each knot tightening as though cinched by invisible hands. Even the master, drunk with rage and restlessness, begins to avoid certain rooms altogether, convinced that her presence lingers in them despite her physical absence. Isolation also magnifies the household's internal paranoia. Servants and visitors, once passive observers, begin to interpret mundane accidents as signs of a lingering, malign presence. Broken tools, spilled water, sudden gusts of wind in closed rooms, and inexplicable sounds at night all feed the narrative of fear. A stable boy refuses to enter the cellar, claiming he heard someone breathing in the dark although he stood entirely alone. A visiting tradesman declines payment in coin, insisting on barter instead, muttering that cursed money spreads cursed fortune. Even distant neighbors who hear the whispers of tragedy unfolding at the estate begin avoiding the property, preferring longer travel routes rather than passing its gates. The surrounding environment mirrors this descent into isolation and decay. The estate's gardens are choked with weeds that rise up like grasping fingers, as though the soil itself rejects cultivation. Fences collapse under rot, their wood darkened with moisture and age, and the once proud fields lie fallow, feeding the perception that nature itself has turned against the household. Animals stray or disappear, the old mare vanishes one night without a trace, the hens refuse to lay, and one of the hounds is found whimpering beneath the porch, eyes wide with terror at something no one else can see. Their absence contributes to the sense of emptiness and abandonment. The narrative emphasizes a visual and emotional symbiosis between human despair and environmental deterioration, suggesting that the estate's decline is total, physical, psychological, and spiritual. Rainwater collects in stagnant pools that reflect glimmers of pale sky like sightless eyes, ivy climbs the brick walls as though trying to reclaim the structure for the earth, and mold encroaches on the corners of ceilings and baseboards like creeping darkness given biological form. The decay is not swift or dramatic, but slow, insidious, and deeply unsettling, mirroring the psychological rot of those who dwell within. The enslaved woman's role during this unraveling is curiously paradoxical. She is the most powerless in status and the least affected in bearing. The more the estate tightens its grasp around her, the more she appears detached, untouchable, almost elemental. While family members argue in hushed, frantic tones, she sits alone with a strange, serene dignity, often staring at the distant tree lean or at the flickering glow of the moon reflected on rainwater. Her silence itself becomes a force, a medium through which the household is compelled to confront its own sins and failures. Some nights, the husband approaches her in secret, seeking not conversation but mere presence, the reassurance of another heartbeat in the darkness. Yet even he finds no solace there. She does not comfort him, but neither does she condemn him. She simply exists beside him, a quiet monument of endurance, and in her presence he feels both humbled and undone. Once, he begins to speak, to confess something unspeakable, but her gaze, calm and unblinking, stops him. Words seem unnecessary and impossible. He leaves with more weight on his chest than before. The climax of the section occurs during a single, harrowing night when a combination of natural and human disasters converge. A sudden storm floods parts of the grounds, a small fire ignites in the smokehouse, and the master suffers a near-fatal collapse from exhaustion and stress. Thunder splits the sky into jagged veins of white, illuminating the estate intermittently in stark, skeletal flashes. Rain pours off the roof in heavy ribbons. The matriarch screams warnings about divine wrath, falling to her knees, soaked and shuddering, as she grips the doorframe. The servants run blindly between tasks, some trying to fight the fire, others attempting to drag the unconscious master from danger. In the midst of this, the enslaved woman remains calm, steady as stone, moving slowly through the chaos like an anchor in a seething ocean. Her actions, or deliberate inactions, underscore the story's theme of endurance as resistance, highlighting the devastating consequences of coercion and cruelty without redemption. She pours water over the burning timbers not with urgency, but with measured grace. She kneels beside the fallen master not with concern, but with quiet, inscrutable observation. She stands beneath the stormlight, soaked through, the wind tearing at her clothing, and seems to absorb the turmoil rather than flee from it. By contrast, the family members behave like frantic specters, flailing against the inevitable decay they themselves have wrought. Throughout this section, the narrative emphasizes psychological depth over sensationalism. The focus is on tension, dread, and the cumulative impact of isolation and oppression. The household's fear reaches a peak, demonstrating how societal and personal failures compound to create an environment where survival is possible only for those who can remain resilient and detached. Shadows dance along corridors as if mocking the inhabitants, every creak of timber becomes a harbinger of doom, and in this heightened atmosphere the enslaved woman's steady quietude assumes an almost supernatural dimension. By the end of this section, the estate is effectively hollowed out. The wells of authority have run dry. The master, once booming and commanding, now lies pale and trembling, voice thin as cobweb. The matriarch, once rigid and self-righteous, wanders the halls in a sleepwalking fugue, clutching her rosary and muttering fractured fragments of prayer. The husband drifts between doors and corners as though searching for a way out not merely of the house but of himself. Servants desert. Tools rust. Candles burn low. The air itself feels abandoned. In this emptiness, the enslaved woman's role as the central, silent force becomes undeniable. Not through open rebellion, nor through vengeance enacted, but through her constant being, her refusal to be spiritually diminished or mentally broken. The narrative leaves the audience with a profound sense of eerie inevitability, that the collapse was not solely due to supernatural forces or personal failings, but rather the interplay of human cruelty, endurance, and the unyielding pressure of circumstance. Her silence becomes legacy, her endurance becomes judgment, her presence becomes the last voice in a place where words have decayed into breathless whispers. This sets the stage for the final reckoning, the dispersal of the household, and the enduring, haunting legacy of the woman who could not be broken. Her isolation, once imposed as punishment, is transformed into testament, a living archive of suffering and strength. And though the estate crumbles and the family fades into obscurity, she remains, a figure etched into the memory of the land itself, embodying the truth that survival, in its quietest form, can be the most powerful form of resistance. This section portrays the ultimate aftermath of the estate's collapse, detailing the lingering silence and the eerie remnants of a household that has been utterly undone. The narrative opens in the bleak light of a late winter morning, the landscape barren and frost-covered, as the ruins of the plantation stand as mute witnesses to the cumulative effects of human cruelty, misfortune, and psychological unraveling. Once grand halls are scorched and sagging, fields lie fallow beneath layers of frost, and smoke rises from burned-out outbuildings where previous attempts to restore order failed catastrophically. The physical destruction mirrors the moral and emotional devastation, establishing an atmosphere of chilling stillness. The enslaved woman's presence is now more symbolic than corporeal. She has been dispersed or gone into hiding, yet stories of her quiet endurance and unyielding spirit begin to circulate among surviving members of the household, nearby communities, and travelers who pass through the area. These recollections are tinged with awe, fear, and ambiguity. Some recount minor acts of sabotage, others speak of a spiritual weight she carried that seemed to influence events without direct intervention. The narrative emphasizes that her legacy is inseparable from the ruin that followed, portraying her as both a witness and an unintentional catalyst for the estate's ultimate collapse. The narrative then focuses on the remaining family members, now fractured and wandering in search of stability. The master, once authoritative and unyielding, is reduced to a hollow figure, wandering aimlessly through neighboring towns, obsessed with the memory of lost control and unable to reconcile with the psychological toll of his actions. The matriarch's mind, broken by guilt and terror, retreats into delusion, interpreting natural sounds and weather patterns as ongoing retribution. The forced husband drifts, consumed by remorse and the impossibility of redemption, carrying with him the silent burden of complicity. Each character's decline is rendered with meticulous psychological detail, emphasizing the slow, grinding consequences of moral failure and coerced oppression. The surrounding community, once intimately connected to the estate, reacts with a mixture of disbelief, superstition, and cautious avoidance. Neighbors whisper about the haunted plantation, but are careful not to associate too closely with the ruined property, fearing contagion of misfortune or the judgment of unseen forces. Local officials, constrained by social and legal norms, officially attribute the estate's demise to mismanagement, fire, and the harshness of winter, refusing to acknowledge the deeper moral and social catalysts. This tension between public narrative and private knowledge reinforces the story's eerie undertone, emphasizing that some truths remain unspoken, circulating only in hushed stories and lingering impressions. The section also delves into the estate itself as a character, describing the way nature reclaims space once dominated by human control. Vines creep over splintered walls, frost etches intricate patterns across broken windows, and wild animals take residence where livestock once grazed. These images evoke a sense of inevitability, portraying the estate's physical decline as an extension of the psychological and moral collapse that preceded it. The narrative captures the poetic symmetry between human frailty and natural reclamation, emphasizing that the ruin is both tangible and symbolic. Attention is given to the stories and legends that emerge in the decades following the collapse. Former servants, displaced neighbors, and travelers all contribute fragments to a collective memory of the enslaved woman whose forced union and silent endurance shaped the fate of an entire household. These stories vary in tone, from reverent to fearful, but consistently underscore her agency and resilience. The narrative demonstrates how oral history preserves the emotional truth of the estate's fall, even when the material evidence has largely vanished. The section reaches its emotional climax with a depiction of the final winter, when the estate is abandoned except for scattered remnants and the occasional traveler who glimpses the ruins. Snow blankets the land, creating a frozen tableau that captures both the permanence of human consequence and the ephemeral nature of individual action. The silence is profound, punctuated only by wind whistling through broken timbers and the distant calls of birds reclaiming the territory. In this stillness, the audience senses the enduring weight of past cruelty, the quiet strength of survival, and the haunting presence of the woman who endured without breaking. By the conclusion of this expanded section, the story emphasizes lingering questions rather than providing neat resolution. Was the ruin inevitable due to moral decay? Was there an unseen, almost supernatural justice at work? Or did the combination of human cruelty, resilience, and circumstance create a collapse that seemed fated? The section leaves the audience with an unsettling sense of ambiguity, allowing the story's psychological, moral, and spectral dimensions to coexist. This carefully constructed ending reinforces the slow-burning, emotionally resonant tone of the narrative and solidifies the story as a haunting historical mystery whose echoes persist long after the final winter has passed. This concluding section serves as the narrative's culmination, tying together the historical events, psychological dynamics, and lingering legends while exploring the unresolved questions that have persisted for generations. It does not simply summarize, it gathers every thread of the story like strands of an intricate tapestry, pulling them together until a fuller, more haunting design emerges. The narrative opens by framing the story within a broader historical and cultural context, emphasizing the tension between documented fact and oral history, between written record and whispered memory, between what was archived and what was endured. Scholars, folklorists, and local historians weigh in, offering multiple, sometimes conflicting interpretations of the enslaved woman's life and the ultimate collapse of the estate. Some insist the destruction of the household was a logical consequence of mismanagement, human cruelty, and the natural hardships of the environment, a story of cause and effect, of sin and consequence. Others argue that the sequence of events bears the unmistakable imprint of an almost supernatural agency, a subtle but relentless force exerted by the woman whose endurance and quiet defiance shaped the fate of all around her. The narrative slows, examining the psychological dimensions of the story in detail. It considers the effects of prolonged oppression, coerced relationships, and stratified social hierarchies not only upon the enslaved woman, but also upon the enslavers, the children of the household, the servants, and even outside observers. The emotional ecosystem of the estate becomes a subject of analysis. Mental health struggles, stress-induced hallucinations, and collective paranoia are explored as plausible explanations for some of the strange occurrences: objects shifting from their places, doors opening and closing of their own accord, voices seemingly emerging out of the darkened corners of the house. These interpretations offer some comfort to the rational mind, yet they fail to account for the precise timing and thematic coherence of the events, the way certain disturbances coincided with specific abuses, how certain incidents followed acts of cruelty or humiliation inflicted upon the enslaved woman. The narrative highlights the interplay between human perception and reality, suggesting that while superstition may have colored their interpretations, the emotional truths of fear, guilt, and endurance are undeniable. Historical accounts are compared and contrasted to uncover patterns of interpretation over time. Early documentation by estate visitors, local officials, and the few surviving family members paints one version: a household destroyed by incompetence, moral failure, disease outbreaks, economic collapse, and the unpredictable forces of nature. In these records, the enslaved woman appears merely as a marginal figure, unnamed, unvoiced, barely acknowledged, a footnote in the tragedy. Oral histories preserved by descendants of the enslaved community, however, emphasize the woman's agency, her quiet but strategic resistance, the spiritual weight she carried, and the inexplicable intuition others sensed around her. In these accounts, she is central, not incidental. This duality creates a persistent tension between empirical record and human memory, underscoring the difficulty of establishing a singular truth and reinforcing the story's lingering, haunting ambiguity. The narrative then considers the symbolism embedded in the estate's downfall. Every element, the ruined fields, abandoned livestock, decayed buildings, rotted fence posts, disappearing ledgers, and fractured family, serves as both literal and figurative evidence of the consequences of unchecked cruelty and coercion. The enslaved woman's endurance emerges as a central theme, illustrating that power is not always overt or violent. Sometimes, influence is exercised through patience, resilience, and subtle disruption. Scholars draw parallels to other historical accounts in which marginalized individuals shape events indirectly, leaving a legacy that is psychological, moral, and even metaphysical in its resonance. The estate does not simply fall, it unravels, strand by strand, as if responding to a long-ignored moral tension that finally reached its breaking point. The section also explores the persistence of folklore surrounding the estate. Stories of the woman's presence, whether in dreams, whispers, apparitions, or unexplained phenomena, are examined with careful attention to detail. Some say she could be sensed rather than seen, a presence felt at one's shoulder, a faint rustling in an empty room, the sensation of being watched by something neither hostile nor benign, simply enduring. These accounts are analyzed not as supernatural proof but as cultural expressions of trauma, memory, and moral reckoning. The narrative discusses how communities use storytelling to process historical injustice, preserve collective memory, and reconcile with events that defy simple explanation. The continued retelling of her story, decades and even centuries later, reinforces the haunting and emotionally resonant qualities that make the tale enduring. Turning to modern perspectives, the narrative introduces contemporary historians, anthropologists, and psychologists who attempt to reconcile the historical facts with the mythologized elements. They consider environmental pressures, drought cycles, soil exhaustion, crop blight, alongside diseases that might have afflicted the household. They explore socio-economic vulnerabilities, debt, inheritance disputes, the weakening of plantation systems, alongside the psychological and cultural dimensions of oppression. Yet even in these modern analyses, the estate's collapse cannot be entirely accounted for. Too many incidents align too closely with the woman's life, her moments of intense emotional strain, and the periods during which her treatment worsened or improved. Too many records contradict each other. Too many witnesses disagreed on what they saw, or what they thought they saw. The story becomes a case study in the limits of human understanding, demonstrating how trauma, endurance, and moral failure intersect in ways that resist tidy categorization. The section delves into unresolved questions that continue to intrigue historians and storytellers alike. Was the estate's destruction inevitable once human cruelty and coercion had reached a tipping point? Did the enslaved woman possess a form of agency or influence that transcended her material limitations, leaving an imprint both psychological and symbolic? Could the sequence of misfortunes, the timing of disasters, and the behavioral patterns of the household be explained solely through natural and human causes, or does something more enigmatic remain at work, something rooted in collective subconscious, moral retribution, or emotional resonance? Each question is presented with nuance, emphasizing the tension between explanation and mystery, certainty and ambiguity. The narrative closes by considering the story's moral and emotional resonance. The enslaved woman, though largely silent in life, emerges as the central figure whose endurance forces reflection on justice, oppression, and the subtle forms of power that persist even under extreme constraint. She becomes a quiet axis around which the fate of the estate revolved, the stillness that revealed the storm. The collapsed estate becomes a cautionary tableau, illustrating how cruelty, mismanagement, and moral blindness can accumulate into total ruin. The story challenges the audience to consider the consequences of human actions, the weight of social and moral responsibility, and the ways in which history remembers those who endured without breaking. Finally, the section leaves the audience with a lingering sense of unease and awe. It emphasizes the story's unresolved nature, inviting reflection rather than offering closure. The estate remains in memory as both a historical fact and a haunting legend, the woman's endurance echoing across generations. The final moments evoke silence and emptiness, punctuated only by subtle traces of life reclaiming the ruins, grass through cracked stone, trees through rotted floors, the quiet turning of soil where footsteps once thundered. It becomes a symbolic reminder that human endurance, moral consequence, and the mysteries of history continue to shape the world in ways both seen and unseen. The narrative concludes with a slow, reflective tone, leaving viewers to ponder the intersections of history, memory, morality, and the indelible mark left by one woman who would not break.